So welcome to the Kanban Coaching Exchange. Great to see everybody this evening. The nights are starting to turn in, or the mornings are getting brighter for some of you, depending on what side of the world that you're on. So tonight at the Kanban Coaching Exchange, we're honoured to have Fernando joining us all the way over from Canada, the Canada Massive. And I first met Fernando through the Kanban University. And what I love about Fernando is if I've got a question or anybody's got a question, he's always there to be able to help people. And I don't know if there is anything that this guy doesn't know. He's just an absolute fountain of knowledge. And so, I'm not proud to say that I kind of like always go and speak to people who are smarter than me to be able to find out the things that I don't know. So it was a real no-brainer for me tonight, and an honour to have Fernando come in and joining us, and hopefully he'll come back when he's amazing and we all learn lots from him. So Fernando is a trainer. He runs training classes. He's also a consultant and a coach. So I'd like to welcome you aboard, Fernando, and hand over the floor to you.
All right. Thank you, Helen, for the introduction, and very nice to meet everyone here and to see people from all over the world, really. And here to talk a little bit about delay. So I will be doing this with Miro. So I will share a link with you. You can follow the presentation. I will share my screen shortly, but if you want to just connect to the Miro board directly and just browse around, that's the link. So let me get that going. Can you all see my screen? All right, fantastic. All right, so we're here to talk about delay. And now, before getting going, so let's see. I am part of a partnership of several consultants and coaches from Canada. Actually, one of the squirrels is also here in the call, Alexi. And we do, well, as Helen just said earlier, we do training, consulting, all things Kanban and Agile in general. So if you're more interested about what we do, follow our website and you can find more information there. But here we're here really to talk about something else. Let's talk about delays. And so I'm going to guess that everybody here, given the context, is familiar with the idea of lead time. So how long it takes to deliver something. And we normally do that by trying to figure out what happens from the moment where a promise is extended, somebody requests something from us, and after that there is some work that takes place, and eventually we say, here it is, right? And we call that span of time lead time. Now, I'm also going to make the assumption that in this particular group, everybody is aware of the fact that within that time span, from the moment where we say, I promise, to here it is, all that time that goes in between, work is not always something that is active. It fluctuates between two states. It's either active or is waiting on something. It's delayed. We actually have a metric to talk about that. We call that flow efficiency. So people familiar with that metric here? The idea of the alternative or how work alternates between these two states is being actively worked on versus being delayed or waiting for something else. And when you add all those things together, you eventually get that span of time we call lead time, right? The amount of time that takes to deliver or finish something, right? Now, this talk today is about not the active time, the effort time, but the part that has to do with delays, right? And we all know that work can experience almost an unlimited number of reasons to be delayed. And actually, recently, in one of our coach camps here, my colleague Martin Aziz ran a session on delays, and he essentially asked people, can you brainstorm reasons that cause things to be delayed? And we came up with a list of things. So I will pose the question to you. In your experience, what are the different things that cause work to be delayed? What are sources of delay that you've seen?
Queues.
Queues. Okay, that's one. Okay, what else? Dependencies on stuff. Yeah, okay, work that depends on others. What else?
Approvals.
Approvals. All right. What else? So if we keep going with this, we will come up with a long list. That's the one you're seeing on the screen. And let me zoom in a little here. From motivational problems to governance to funding to projections and forecasts, death by meetings, so a whole bunch of things. Now, oops, not that. The problem with just coming up with the list of this is sometimes very difficult to reason about this very long list. So we were actually having a conversation about this, and the word bottleneck came up, because when we talk about delays, many times people just say, well, that eventually causes a bottleneck somewhere. And that caused Alexi, who is here somewhere in the call, to give us one of his Alexisms. So Alexi has this wonderful moments where he just comes up with a small little sentence that tells us something that leaves us thinking for months and months until we actually figure out something very profound. And this was one of them. So he said, bottleneck is the Kanban word for snow. And I've generalized this to the word delay. So delay is the Kanban word for snow. So the idea here is, or the concept he was referring to is this one. So has anyone heard of this story? The story of the Inuit having many, many, many words to refer to the word snow, right? So we in English call it snow. They call it, well, different things depending on the type of the snow, the characteristics, the color, how fluffy it is or how hard it is. And the wonderful thing about this is that it transfers, it conveys lots of meaning, lots of nuance, right? So if we just refer to just delays as just a single word, that removes part of that nuance, and it might make sense to just have a richer vocabulary for that, a collection of words we can use to look for delays, because that will help us reason about it, and it will help us perhaps understand our process, look for those things, because in that journey that goes from I promise to here it is, most of that time is actually delay. Right? We know that lead time tends to be dominated by delays. Delays have a huge impact in lead time. So if we identify those different things that cause delays, and somehow we can reason about them, and we can come up with strategies to mitigate those, then that's a very actionable and pragmatic way to improve our lead times, our delivery capability. So this is what this talk is really about, is identifying a bunch of categories that can help us identify types of delays. So we may have lots and lots of delays that we can identify in specific situations, but can we classify all those various forms of delays into some buckets that help us reason about it and perhaps develop some strategies to cope with it, right? So, and in general terms, what we can do is we can think of delay as falling in some of these cases. So imagine that you have some sort of process represented by this Kanban board, and we will notice as work moves through this board, at some point it will eventually hit, for example, some sort of queue. And some of you already mentioned this as an explicit form of delay. Queues and buffers is going to be one category of delay. In some other cases, work will eventually progress to the point where it cannot move any further because it depends on the availability of something or someone who is not available at the time. So we call that non-instant availability problems. Somebody already mentioned dependencies, and by dependencies, in the context of this talk, I'm going to refer to the cases where work starts in one group and at some point it cannot continue any further because there is some other related work that needs to happen in other group or service or team. I'm not talking about dependencies between pieces of work or dependencies between people within a team, but dependencies, inter-team dependencies. So that's going to be another category for delays. And then there are a couple of more that perhaps are not the ones that come to mind immediately. But imagine, for example, you have lots of work accumulating in one of the activities of your workflow. You have lots of WIP. What will happen in those cases is you will end up with lots of task switching. And so we will talk about how task switching ends up being another form of delay. And finally, another form of delay we will discuss today is any cases where work is preempted by other work, so any form of preemption, right? So this was the shorter version of this talk. So if we want to talk about delay, there are a myriad of different things that end up causing delays. We can classify them in some categories that gives us a richer vocabulary than simply saying delay or bottleneck. So let's start talking about all these things in one at a time. Would there be any questions before we go? By the way, I would prefer to make this interactive as we can. If there are questions or comments, just feel free to just voice them up, and we'll take things from there. All right. Okay. So let's talk about the first category, queues and buffers, which interestingly enough was one of the first things that you mentioned here. Now look at this board that you see in front of you, the one in the front and the center of the screen. Sometimes you will look at the process and queues will be there and obvious. So can you point out the obvious queues in this process?
The done.
Okay, the done is going to be another queue. Let's maybe I should have qualified the question.
Sorry, testing done, analysis done.
Analysis. Okay. The done columns within the process. Yes, because there is arguably a big queue in the pool of options and a big pile of stuff in done. Let's keep those outside the process. They are outside the I promise to hear these lines, right? So okay, so I think it was Helen. She was saying, well, we could consider this a queue. Oops, not that one.
So it's selected and ready for deployment.
So yeah, so this would be one queue because it's waiting for the next step, right? But somebody just mentioned the selected. That would be another obvious queue. Work is just waiting just to be taken. And then there is a ready for deployment column here. And yes, if you squint and you see get Kanban in that board, you wouldn't be completely wrong. Okay, so these are the obvious queues that you can just identify by looking at the process, perhaps represented in a board. Unfortunately, many times teams will just use simpler boards, perhaps something like this, or even something like this, where we don't have too much visibility on the process itself, but that doesn't mean queues are not there, right? So once we are aware of the fact that there are queues somewhere in our workflows and we need to identify them, then we need to figure out how we find them. Because if we found our queues, then we can ask questions like all the questions you have here, right? Let's leave this for now. How long does the work actually stays in the queue? What is the policy to actually deal with the queue? Are things taken in the queue in some sort of order? Are they reprioritized? Are we selecting them with some criteria? How big do we allow these queues to form? So if we start asking questions like this, then we can get into some sort of, we can define policies about how we want to deal with these queues, and eventually get to the most important question, which is, do we really need this queue? Is there anything we can do to remove it? Because if we remove queues, that may remove, some waiting stages that we perhaps are not helping with our process or our deliverable, right? So what are some questions you can ask? One of the first I tend to ask is there any handoffs happening here? So let me move this board out away. Let's assume this is the board that your team uses. I would start by asking the following question. Is there any handoffs happening here? Because sometimes some groups hand off work to other people within the group. For example, the developers end up handing off work to the testers, or the BAs they hand off work to the developers. And we are not representing that. So if somehow we start showing that on the board, maybe we have just discovered a queue represented by some sort of handoff, right? So, and by the way, the reason I'm asking usually these questions is so that we can start visualizing what the process really looks like, because something that starts with to do in progress done maybe really means dev, ready for test, and then done. Ready for test, then testing, then done. So the idea here is to start identifying these queues and making them visible somehow, so we can then reason about them. So another question I like to ask is if there are any verification or approvals at some point in the workflow, because sometimes it's not a matter of handoffs, but somebody having a saying on how the work needs to move from one step to the next. I worked with a team once that had for example, code reviews in place. So before we can do any testing, a lead needs to review the work and then approve it before it goes into test. Well, that's another waiting stage, which also means that it's not just a ready for test column, there is a waiting for code review column that we could add to the board, right? Another question that may be important to ask is there any work that is collected in batches? So for example, have you seen cases where we will develop a bunch of user stories, for example, but before the testers can see them, we need to wait until all the stories are finished. So because testers do not want to test stories one at a time, they test them in batches, right? Is there any internal batching mechanism in your process? So that would mean that, for example, you need to add another column, for example, waiting for test or waiting for feature completion, that where all the stories accumulate until they're all ready to move into testing. So internal batching mechanisms, or sometimes the batching mechanism occurs towards the end. The ready for deployment column would be an example of that. So we can't deploy stories one at a time. We need to deploy them once they are all together. For example, all the stories are part of an epic or a feature are put together before they go out. So that's another batching mechanism that sometimes it's present, that if we start visualizing, then we can start explaining why it takes what it takes to put things out. Right? Is there any done work that is waiting for other work to be done? So a question for people in the group: do you have deployment of code, for example, or functionality that is hidden behind the feature flag, that is deployed into production, but it's actually hidden? Nobody can use it until other work arrives, or an approval is made, or some other condition is met, and then we turn it on, and then it becomes available, right? So that's another hidden queue. So we may put the story in the done column, but it's not really done because there is more work to be done later to just enable the feature flags and put the work in production along with other work, right? So this can be another feature, another column in the board, something like waiting for a feature flag enablement, for example. That's another example of this one, work that is done but not usable by the customer. And finally, another question I like to ask is if there is a mechanism that is used to prevent starvation. So that's usually the selected column, that in a team that picks up work, for example, to fill up a time box, a sprint, for example, you're working on 2-week intervals. Well, you do that so that during the sprint you have enough work to keep the team going without starvation. That means that there's some sort of selected column that sometimes is not visualized. So if that case happens, then I like to add another column where we make explicit the fact that we take in another batch, essentially, for the purpose of preventing starvation. All right. All right. Any questions so far? Make sense? All right. Now, there is another question that you can ask looking for these queues that sometimes reveals a queue, but it's actually the sign of something else. Because sometimes what happens is work needs to queue up because it depends on somebody else that is part of the team or outside the team, really, but that person is not immediately available. So the question to ask is, do you rely at any point in time on someone who is not, someone or something that is not instantly available? And usually that will manifest itself as a queue of work waiting for someone. But the real reason for the queue is the unavailability of a person or a machine or an environment or something else, a resource in the broadest sense of the word. So that's another type of delay that I'd like to treat as a separate category, is the problem of non-instant availability. So non-instant availability refers precisely to the need to access a person, a machine, a resource of any kind, but that resource is not available at the time when the work needs it. So the result of that is a queue forming in front of this resource. And well, the first countermeasure I would suggest for a problem like this is start by visualizing the work, visualizing that the queue is there and it's caused by an unavailability problem, so that you can get a sense of how much of a problem this is. So I told you a moment ago about the story of this team that had the need for running code reviews, right? So we do development of user stories. Before they can go into testing, we have the rule that we are going to code review them. So all these conversations started with me talking to this team's Scrum Master. He was he was trying to figure out why it was taking them so long to get into testing and why things weren't moving. And well, we looked at the board and I started asking what happens, why is it that this ticket can't move? Well, it's waiting for a code review. And it turns out that the rule they had is that the code review had to be done by a senior developer only, and this senior developer was too busy, right? So essentially we've placed an internal dependency on a specialist, and this specialist has limited availability. These people were pulled into other meetings, pulled into other work, they had to help with other teams. So essentially they weren't available when the stories were ready to move into testing. So the first thing we do was just to make it visible, just to make sure that everybody was clear on what work was waiting for that type of specialty to be available. So we added a column in between called waiting for code review, just to visualize the problem. That will give you an idea of the magnitude of the problem. And sometimes this is going to be enough because that calls people's attention to the fact that work is waiting, so that may create availability, but that may not be enough. Now, when we run into this type of situation, when the problem is the problem of not instant availability, the tool we can reach out for help is theory of constraints. So how many people here are familiar with theory of constraints? Okay, I see one hand going up, two hands going up. So for those of you who might not have heard about this, it's a management theory that comes mostly from manufacturing, and it deals with the problem of bottlenecks, so constraints in a flow, so places in the flow where work cannot flow as fast as in the others, and work tends to accumulate just before that. And in particular, theory of constraint has a series of ideas called the 5 focusing steps that help you deal with bottlenecks. So this is where actually the word bottleneck is mostly associated with, the theory of constraints. Now we can use ideas from theory of constraints as inspiration for solving types of problems like non-instant availability. And we don't need to go through all the details of theory of constraints. What's important to know is that theory of constraints recommends you to take three types of strategies to deal with the bottlenecks, or in this case availability problems. And the recommendation is that you apply them in order, right? So you start with protection strategies, and if those are not enough to solve your problem, then you move to subordination strategies. If those don't work, then you move to elevation strategies. So the idea is that you try to solve the problem with one strategy that is the least costly, or the one that can be more directly effective before moving into some others that may be more expensive or cause more disruptions or be more risky, right? So in this case, protection means essentially protecting or removing the distractions from the bottleneck. So in this case, if you're relying on a person who is not instantly available, you need to make sure that the moment they are available, they are not distracted with anything else, so you can get the most effectiveness of the little availability they have. And that sometimes is enough. So if you just protect the non-instantly available resource from the distractions, you make sure they can focus, that could be enough to remove most of the delays. But sometimes that's not enough. Maybe you need to do some other things, moving into subordination type of actions. So subordination refers to making decisions in other places of the workflow. So protection is done at the bottleneck. Subordination is downstream, usually, upstream of the bottleneck, usually, or in some other parts of the process. The idea is that you make decisions in other parts of the process that make those other parts subservient or subordinated to the decisions you make in the bottleneck, so that everybody's contributing to making the bottleneck as effective as possible, right? So, for example, in this case, if we need to make sure that if we still want to have the code reviews done by this team lead, for example, we could make decisions in the other process to make sure that by the time the work gets to the team lead is already just for the it's perfectly ready for the code review that will take place without, for example, needs to add add additional work to it. That could make other parts of the process a little bit more inefficient, but we're taking the hit in the other parts of the process because, well, they have more capacity than the bottleneck, right? So maybe what we will make sure that by the time we get to the code review, the developer has entered, for example, has checked in all the code, make sure that all the conflicts are resolved before we emerge into a code review branch, for example. They had something like that going on in that particular team. So let's make sure that by the time the work arrives to the bottleneck, other things have happened so that the code review can happen, in the least amount of time. That may mean adding more work somewhere else in the process, right? That we are subordinating that part of the process to the process that takes place in the part that is constrained, right? Now, if all that doesn't work, then we can think about how to increase capacity, and that's what we call elevation strategies. So that's where we start thinking about increasing capacity. Maybe we need to have more people doing code reviews. Maybe we need to have automation. Maybe we need to have some sort of other improvements that will essentially increase our capacity to do that part of the process that is resource constrained. Now, the interesting part of this, of thinking through all these steps, is that you may notice that the increased capacity type of strategy is the one that comes at the last. So we tend to think the other way. If we think that a part of the process is capacity constrained, our first inclination is to try to increase capacity there. Theory of constraints will direct us, will guide us to think of that last. And that's usually because steps like this tend to be more expensive, more time consuming, more risky. And there may be other things that we could do that could alleviate the problem and just get us out of the onerous delay without having to incur into all those risks or expenses. Make sense? Any questions? All right.
If anybody does have a question and you don't want to ask it out loud, pop it in the chat channel and I'll always ask it for you.
All right. Now let's move to some other form of delay that sometimes we don't tend to see this as a source of delay, but it's surprisingly one of the ones that cause most of the impact sometimes. So does anyone recognize these? Is that familiar to anyone? Who here has played Get Kanban? So if you have played Get Kanban, you might be even in a position to recognize what step of Get Kanban or what part of a Get Kanban story this picture comes from. Any guesses?
When douchey Carlos comes in and ruins everything.
This is a Carlos storm, right? Yeah, good eye. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the whole story, Get Kanban is a game we use in Kanban training. It's a simulation of, well, a Kanban system. There is a process, there are cards that move through a process, and we roll dice to move the cards along. And one day, well, there is a team working on features, essentially. And one day they hire a test manager, and this test manager is called Carlos. And Carlos removes WIP limits and changes a bunch of policies. And the result of that is the accumulation of work in the testing activity, which is what you see here. Essentially, lots and lots of work in process in one part of the process, okay? When teams play this game well, they end up with a bunch of things on the testing column, and it causes lots of trouble, and it's very, very fun. Really recommend it. If you haven't played it, give it a try. Now, this is a real life Carlos-like situation. So this comes from a project I was helping with one day, and what you're seeing here is this is the in progress column, the ready to start column, and there were more columns to both sides. They didn't look much different. They were lots and lots and lots of stickies, so lots and lots of work. So what's the problem with having lots and lots of WIP? So the problem is your capacity, of course, is limited. So in the game, we simulate capacity with dice. So in this case, there are two dice that represent your testing capacity. You can think of the dice as two developers or two teams. It doesn't really matter. The game is a little ambiguous in that sense. The point is that you have some limited capacity to do some activity, in this case, testing, that's represented with two dice, right? And you apply the capacity by assigning dice to tickets, right? So if you have two dice, how many tickets can you work on at any given point in time? There are two dice. How many tickets? There are two tickets, right? So maybe two if every dice represents a person, maybe they both can collaborate and pair up and work on one ticket. The point is you won't be able to work on more than one ticket at any given point in time. Then all the others will wait. So this is why I'm saying that high WIP should be considered as a source of delay, because the moment you hit one of these places where lots of stuff accumulate, your capacity is limited, you will be working on some of them, the others will have to wait. Maybe you will task switch. So you'll work a little bit on one ticket and then a little bit on another ticket, and then you switch to another. That's fine. It will give you the impression of progress across multiple tickets. But in the meantime, all the others will wait. So it's one way or another, lead time will accumulate in this column. Now, there are many effects that are the result of having high WIP. And I have collected some of them here that we can reason about. So, on one of the dimensions is that multitasking will likely increase. With multitasking, where our ability to focus will decrease. And with that, what will happen is that the likelihood of introducing defects or lowering quality will actually increase. So this is something that has been noticed in the Kanban community for a long time. There's a good correlation really between amount of work, WIP, and level of quality. And it tends to be that when WIP goes up, quality goes down. This is one of the reasons. Your ability to focus decreases. The chances of introducing mistakes or just forgetting about stuff, and then that leads to mistakes and so on. So the connection between WIP and quality is something that's been known for a while. We could also imagine how it will cause a significant cognitive overload. We need to remember more things, which could lead to things like what you see on the screen: paralysis, stress, lack of transparency. But the other things that I think sometimes we don't connect these dots. Sometimes I notice. So have you heard people saying we have too many meetings, for example? One of the problems we have is we have too many meetings, right?
You do.
Yeah. So, well, in those cases, what I like to recommend people is to do a mental search and replace. So when you hear too many meetings, search for too many meetings and replace for too much work, because that's what's happening. So the too many meetings situation tends to be because there are too many things in process. So we just don't do the work. We need to talk about it. We need to discuss it. We need to analyze it. We need to prioritize it. We need to do lots of other things that require, for example, lots of meetings. There is lots of considerable overhead just with having too much work. So that's another effect that having lots of WIP will cause, which then will introduce even more delay. And of course, there is the problem of the work just aging in place. So how many of you track aging in your Kanban boards? I see some hands going up. So that's a useful tool to manage flow, because you can know how long things have been there already, and that may lead you to some decisions. So what we need to remember about something aging in place is that the more something stays in this undone state, the more the chances that, for example, your customer will change their minds, right? So we started something because it was a good idea. By the time we developed it or we delivered it, well, the market has changed and this need is not there anymore. So maybe the situation has changed, or maybe the customer changed their mind. So they wanted blue initially, but now they wanted green. And all that took is that the time that it took us to deliver for them to change their mind. So some value may be lost, which will tie into something we'll discuss later, which is failure demand. So the whole point of this is just to make the connection between how simply having too much work in process in themselves is a source of delay, because it causes all these type of effects. And in addition, there is this other problem of just decreasing trust. There are many things that will conspire against us simply because we introduce defects, for example, or because the work becomes less valuable the more time it takes to be delivered, and that eventually causes a trust issue, which fuels other sorts of problems, right? Now, we know in the Kanban community, we know how to deal with the too much WIP problem. We have things like WIP limits, WIP management, and WIP control, right? So any of the many different strategies you can hear about that lead you to some sort of constrained amount of work will help alleviate these problems. And by setting some sort of WIP strategy in place that can help you mitigate the part of the delay that is coming from this particular source. All right. Now, talking about value that decays and mistakes, that leads me to yet another category of things that sometimes are not seen as source of delay, but I think we should actually include it in this category, which is failure demand. So how many people are familiar with the term failure demand? If you were to define failure demand, how would you define it?
Failure demand is demand to do work following a failure, in contrast with a demand to do work to add value rather than fix bad value.
Right. So I think I had this discussion with some people. The name is not, it's not a happy name. Maybe we should find a different name for this, because people tend to associate failure demand with a personal failure, right? Nobody likes that. But it refers, as Robert is saying, is our failure to completely deliver value before. That's what this represents, right? So we've done some work that delivers some value, but some of that value was left on the table, and then we need to do some remediation work. That's failure demand, right? I prefer to describe it more as the work we would rather do less of. So if we want to do more of value demand, the failure demand is the type of work we still need to do. It's not a personal failure, a team failure, but it's the kind of work we would like to do less of, right? Things like defect fixes, things like manual work and workarounds. I worked with a team at some point that had, they built an application, and this was a database intensive application. And each time they had a release, their support manager knew that there was a wave of data fixes coming right after. And the result of that was the new release would introduce some problems in the database that would cause items to be corrupted, for example, or missing data items or so on. So it was like clockwork. Release goes out, data fixes come out next week. So that's typical failure demand. So it can take also the form of workarounds. We put the system out, but there are some steps that the user cannot do directly in the application. They need to be done manually, so they come to us to do that. Or another example was an application that had a reporting capability, and it would cover most of the reports, but for some reports, the users would need to come back to the team to just manually add the reports into the system. So there was no way of adding new needs for new reports. So all that type of work could be considered failure demand, because it's essentially it's remediation for what we've done before, that it doesn't cover all the expected value or the needed value for that initial work, right? Deliberate technical debt, I've included that into the list. You might be familiar with Martin Fowler's classification of various types of technical debt. So then that's a big discussion for a different day, perhaps. But what's important to know here is that sometimes we make decisions that will introduce some sort of deficiency in design or implementation, for example, and we do that deliberately. Well, that will eventually have to be fixed and will come back as failure demand if it becomes a problem. Well, I would include that in this category as well. Very different from the failure demand that is included by accident, because lack of knowledge or accident or things like that. So in general, the strategy to deal with problems like this usually have to do with allocating capacity for the work and eventually finding and removing the root causes for that. So if we want to remove this as a source of delay, oh, by the way, why is it a source of delay? So why am I including this as a source of delay? Any guesses?
It distracts us.
Distracts, yeah. So this is time we need to spend on something, which means we cannot spend that time on something else that is more valuable. So from the perspective of that other work, this is delay, right? So because I'm working on a defect fix, I cannot work on that new feature that I started yesterday, right? Because we were working on the project and the project needs to stop because we have production issues to deal with and the project is delayed. So it's a little counterintuitive perhaps, but we need to see from the perspective of the value demand. So the value demand is usually delayed because we need to deal with the failure demand. So that's why I'm including this as a source of delay. So it's disruptive, it delays other work, adds to the overhead we discussed earlier. So value demand, failure demand will also have to be managed. So have you been in the, for example, production defect triage and prioritization sessions, where we need to discuss what of all these things, which ones do we fix, and what goes on hold because we have them, and so on. So it adds to all that overhead. Now, my recommendation for this type of work is start by understanding what that demand is. First, what's the proportion? So if you look at all the work that you do, start by having an agreement of which of the work that you do is part of your failure demand and what part is your value. What are you going to consider value demand and failure demand, right? So in the example you're seeing here, if a team produces features, reports, defect fixes, data fixes, and production incidents, well, some of them are part of your value demand, some of them are part of your failure demand, and then start by understanding what the proportion is of all those with respect to the total work you do, right? And yes, we can discuss whether this is a fair comparison because some of them may be very small and very big. All that needs to be thrown into the analysis, but in general, I would like to know what's the proportion. If for example, for a software development team, if I'm putting a release out, how much of that release in terms of some measure of proportion is value, how much is failure? Is that a number we're concerned about, right? What are the trends? Are these two types of work going up or down, right? So if I am seeing failure demand going up, well, I need to take some corrective action for that. There is something else that I need to fix so that this eventually doesn't grow so big that prevents me from delivering the value I need to do, right? Now, so understand trends, understand the proportions, agree on which is which, and based on that, focus on removing root causes and allocating capacity for each of them. So, allocating capacity for dealing with failure demand, right? So one of the things that we notice in lots of teams is that there isn't usually enough time allocated for dealing with, for example, defects. We make project plans for delivering lots of work, but then we forget that we need to reserve some capacity for all the defects we put out, right? So allocation of capacity, perhaps using some intangible work for improvements that are ongoing to deal with root causes. That's the kind of thing that will help eventually remove this source of delay. All right. Before I move to the next topic, any questions so far? All right, let's talk about the next. Dependencies. So that's the last category I wanted to mention today. So somebody mentioned dependencies earlier. It's definitely a big concern. Now, it's a big topic as well. So we could have just a whole session just to talk about dependency management. There is a couple of things I wanted to take away from this as it comes to the problem of dealing with this as a delay problem. So imagine that you have two services, the blue service and the orange service, or two teams. They both have their lead time distribution, so their managers or delivery managers know what their capability is, and they both depend on some shared service, like the green team here, right? Which also has its own distribution of lead time, right? So the important thing to remember here is that the moment that you are relying on some other group, their lead time distribution will be eventually embedded into yours, right? So the time that it takes for them to do work is in part what it takes your work to be done. So what happens in that case if the lead time distribution of the shared service is very unpredictable and long? What will happen to your lead time distribution?
It'll be unpredictable and long too.
You will inherit their unpredictability, right? So if I depend on an unpredictable service, that will make me unpredictable, no matter much what I do, right? So I have seen many people or many teams trying to solve the dependencies problem by careful planning, right? So all we need to do is to carefully plan and schedule. But the thing is, the moment you realize this, it means that no careful planning and schedule will work around it. So you're dealing with something unpredictable, therefore planning won't help, right? So that would be it's usually my first message when we discuss dependencies. It's not a planning and scheduling problem. Right? It's not really that type of problem. It's really a collaboration problem. The only solution to the dependencies issue is that all these three managers need to get together, understand their own services, their own capability, and collaborate to make the whole system work. So it's a completely different game. It's a collaboration game. It's not a planning and scheduling game, right? Now that's assuming that the three managers want to collaborate and can collaborate, especially the shared dependence, the shared service, the guy with the blue cap, right? Now, failing something like that, something collaboratively with your dependencies, at the very least, what you can do is you can essentially you will need to balance two separate concerns, right? So you will have to decide how much upfront discovery you need to make so that you will minimize the chance of hitting the dependency at the right time or that affecting you too much, right? That, of course, can lead you to analysis paralysis or very, very, very long upfront planning and analysis, right? So I worked with a team one time that had a dependency on a marketing team. So they were updating a website. And if they had to change text, for example, or any graphical elements in the website, they had to go to the marketing department to get their copy and their approval and all that. And the team lead from this team eventually realized, she intuitively observed that it would take usually around 15 days for marketing to get back to her, right? So each time I talk to them, it takes around 15 days to get back, right? So that meant two things. I could just start work in my teams. If I am the team lead for that team, I can start work. And if by chance I hit the marketing dependency, that automatically means a 15-day delay for me, right? So that would be essentially the let it be strategy for the dependency. We just start the work, and if we hit the dependency, well, let's let it be, and we pay a price, right? If the dependency is unpredictable, I will inherit the unpredictability, essentially, right? Now, the other thing that could happen here is I could just analyze the stories before deciding to start them, or the work. I could analyze the work before starting it, try to figure out if this will have a dependency on marketing. I could delay my start until marketing has done their part. So I could engage my dependencies early. So do some sort of upfront dependency discovery analysis, essentially, much more analysis, identify that I will hit the dependency, engage them earlier, and then schedule my work to start after that. This is what this team ended up doing. So they look at their stories, at their features. They had a few things they knew where to look at. And if they detected they were going to need marketing, they would call marketing, schedule the work, and then wait up to 15 days to get their work started. So it would delay the start, but at least it wouldn't delay the completion after, right? Now, these are like two extremes. What I'm trying to say here is that between these two things, you will have to find an appropriate balance, how much of this price you want to pay, because essentially you're delaying the start to avoid the delay in completion, essentially. The delay is still there, right? So the solution, the real solution at the end is for the marketing team to get to give the results in less than 15 days, which is what this team really needed, right? But if that's not possible, at the very least, on the calling team, let's say, I have the option to just decide how much time I need to spend on dependency discovery upfront versus paying the cost later. So you will have to find some sort of happy medium, and this is how you can deal with the delay of the dependency. Right? At least sometimes if you can avoid, for example, making a commitment, which was their case. So they had the ability to defer commitment for the work and make no promises. So in their case, it was a viable option to say, well, we will talk to marketing and then engage them after and delay the promise. But if you cannot do that, well, maybe you will have to start the work and then hit the dependency at some point and take the penalty, right? The point here is that the only solution eventually at the end is going to be for these two managers to talk, the marketing manager to make their process a little bit more their lead and distribution a little bit more compact, and have some sort of agreement about how this marketing department is going to serve multiple customers, because that's the problem with shared services, really. They have multiple customers with multiple demands and so on. Mike has a question.
I have a question about this.
Yes.
Going back to what you said about the influence of the distribution of lead times for the shared service provider on the distribution of lead times for the customer, that is to say the team using the shared service. It seems to me that you can't simply add the two the impact is not additive. The impact is always going to be worse than that.
Yeah, it's what I meant to say is that one is embedded in the other, is affected by the other. I didn't mean that you would just add.
Correct. But what I'm trying to get at is a deeper understanding of just what that impact is, how to quantify that impact.
Mm-hmm.
It must be very complex at a mathematical level, but is there a rule of thumb or some way of predicting by experience what the impact would typically be?
So you can observe, you can effectively measure their lead time distribution. This is what this team lead I was telling you about did. So she started observing, I send this to marketing today, it comes back 15 days later. I send it today, it comes back 10 days later. So you can measure how long it takes for the shared service to respond to you and essentially reverse engineer their distribution, at least from your perspective, right? That will give you an idea. And this is how this team lead figured out that the 15 days was their mark, right? So other than that, I don't see any way. So, but this is how I would do it: just observing what happens, and based on the past experience, record the response, record the time that it takes for them to respond to you, and that gives you an idea of what their lead times could be.
Fernando, are you able to hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Let me, if I may, just give an example of what I'm thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a WIP limit of 1, and then you send something off to another team for work, so now you're sitting there waiting. So people will say, well, let's make it a WIP limit of 2. So while I'm waiting for the other team, I can do something useful. Or maybe a WIP limit of 3 would be more appropriate. I don't know. But by adjusting such things as your own WIP limits, you can potentially have an influence on what the overall impact of the dependency will be. So my question is there any rule of thumb that people have come up with to try to predict, without going into deep mathematical analysis, what the ideal proportions will be? Or is it just try it and see how it works?
I will try and answer, and I see Alexi has his hand up, so he probably can speak more on the mathematical side, or maybe not. But my answer would be, I don't think this is something you necessarily predict. So you will observe your own lead time. So I started the item here, I ended it here. This is my lead time. Part of that is going to be the time that it was consumed by the dependency. All right. And I can measure that. You're right in the sense that it's not going to be a simple addition. It's not that I can just add. I just know that, for example, my lead time is between 10 days and 30 days, and their lead time is between 1 day and 10 days, right? So how that one ends up being embedded in the other, that's a different conversation. Now, the WIP limit part that you're referring to is very true. So if the moment you have a dependency, you need to be careful about how you're limiting WIP on your side, because you don't want to necessarily be idle just waiting for the other side, right? And there are several strategies we recommend people. Some of them is you limit the amount of work you keep in your workflow, but not necessarily the ones that are waiting on dependencies, because you don't want to stall your team simply because you have lots of work waiting for other group, right? Alex, I think you had something to add.
I just wanted to shine some light on this question very quickly. And I guess the most important, people have been doing this for a very long time now. Exactly what Robert asked about. And I think the key bit of advice here is do not theorize and do not don't be overly mathematical with it. There's a very practical way to go about it is you basically, your own lead time, your services lead time, you can get the data. That embeds whatever delays occurred on whatever work item due to all possible reasons for delay. Now start working from right to left, starting with the longest running work items. Those are the ones that likely incurred the most sources of delay and had the longest impact. And by having some sort of retrospective on those items, you can find out, effectively reverse engineer what sources of delay are, what they were actually, and what the total impact of the source of delay was. And of course, Robert is correct that the amount of delay is not deterministic, because in addition to let's say the shared services lead time, there could be some time lost on the handoff from one service to another and then backwards, and then some time will be lost because the resumption of work by the original service is not instant. But whatever all these non-deterministic sources are, at the end of the day, at the end of the life cycle of a work item, they add up to fairly specific number of days. And you can find out what that is by retrospecting on the previously completed work items. And going right to left is usually practically more beneficial, because those are the work items that hit the most delays and suffer
the most examples, right? Mm-hmm. All right, cool. Thanks, Alexei. Mike has his hand up.
Yeah, I'm hoping this time you can hear me. So in terms of your mitigation strategies, just one that I'm surprised that isn't in here is to actually get rid of your dependency entirely. So your marketing example would be a really good one. Invite them to your stand-ups, if indeed you have stand-ups. If you have dependencies with DevOps, try and pull a DevOps person into your team so that they can actually do the work for you. Getting rid of dependencies is always the best way to deal with dependencies.
Well, okay. So the topic of dependencies is large, and if I were to talk about this alone, one of my prefixes would be, this is assuming that you cannot do that, right? So the thing is, yes, in theory, I would agree that the best way of removing dependencies is getting rid of the dependency. That's in the abstract. In practice, though, I found that sometimes organizations find that very, very difficult. And that's why this is not included as your first go-to strategy. So yes, having a marketing analyst in the team would have solved the problem. The thing is, they didn't have enough marketing analysts to put a marketing analyst in every single team, right? So eventually you will end up with a shared service no matter how you do it. So what this organization eventually did is they tried to do this. They tried to send marketing analysts to most teams, right? But they didn't have enough of them to send one to every team. So some teams had marketing analysts, some of them didn't. The ones that were in a team ended up working for more than one team. So they ended up having a shared service no matter what. It was like an embedded, distributed shared service now. So they didn't get rid of the problem, right? So this is the reason why I didn't list it here. The reorganization solution sounds very nice, and I would agree that from a purely, let's say, conceptual point of view, is the cleanest solution. The problem is that many organizations can't do that. And in some cases, there may be situations where it's actually not desirable, right? In that same organization, they had a group working with a backend system in a very specialized environment. I think it was an AS400, some sort of mainframe. It's not only that they didn't have enough people in that group to send one to every team, is that you don't want to do that because all these people need to work very closely together to follow some rules. And if you put them in different places, that will create a coordination problem that was enormous, right? So there may be some very good reasons why you may still need to get or keep your shared services as shared services. This is a reason why it wasn't there, but point taken. So the removal of the dependency should at least be considered. Is this something that is viable in the situation we are in, right?
In very much the same way that you've got a hierarchy for TOC, I would just add it to the top of the hierarchy, but you're right. Sometimes you can't always do the easiest option, and you've got to go through to other mitigation strategies.
Yeah, conceptually, I would agree is the cleanest. There are practical implications though that makes it sometimes not very likely to happen. Right? At least in the experience I've had with the clients I work with. All right, I think we're all at the end of the session already. So the only thing that was left for me to do is to say thank you, and I can stay for longer to have another round of questions and conversations, but if you need to leave, I think this is the end of it. This is all I had to say. Just as a way of closing this up, let's go back to this idea of let's try to avoid having a myriad of hundreds and hundreds of different sorts of delays. And let's avoid the other extreme, which is to call everything a bottleneck or just delay. And let's agree on having some categories for delays. The ones you're seeing on the screen are the ones I'm proposing that we could use as at least a conceptual way of thinking about the problem. As I was putting together the slides, it occurred to me that we can further consolidate this into. There are some sources of delay that have to do with work waiting in workflow. So as part of the workflow, work will wait. There are some other cases where it's working because the work in my workflow is waiting for work to happen in some other workflow. That's the case of dependencies, for example. And then there is the category of work that has delays caused by all sorts of preemption. I didn't get to talk about things like expedites and various classes of service that will also can cause some delays for good reasons sometimes, but it's also another source of delay. So we could also see it from that perspective. But with all this, thank you so much for your attention. I hope this was useful, and let's open the floor for questions and discussion if you have the time.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Fernando. Let's give him a virtual round of applause. I told you he was going to be a mine of information. I do not lie. Okay, so we've got time for a couple of questions. I'm going to have to limit you tonight because I've literally got to travel to London. But has anybody got any questions at all for Fernando? Oh, we've got a question from Maro in the chat. Might sound too obvious, just need to make sure I get the analogy as you intended it to be taken. Do you mean by snow the same thing as sand?
The snow is the same thing as sand.
He means snow, Maru.
No.
In that the Inuits have like a gazillion words for snow.
Well, so depending on who tells the story is going to be sand or snow, and it's going to be or 200 or so. Yeah, I think the metaphor is we have one word that represents lots of other things. And as I have also heard that this is really an urban myth, is more than the legend than the reality, but yeah. Snow goes away at some point. Well, so does delay. Eventually delay goes away.
Maru was also asking me like where he can find some of your other work. Is there one place where he can find your videos, your blogs, or anything like that, Fernando?
Yes. Let me share the screen again. So you can go to the squirrelnorth.com site. Actually, I wrote a series of articles recently about sources of delay. You will find them there, and there is more material there. I will post the slides. So, Helen, would you like me to send you a link to a slide share or something like that? You can distribute
please
it.
do.
Yeah. So I will publish these slides, and yep. But you can go to the Squirrel North site for more material.
Any questions at all? Get your hands up. Get them in the chat channel. Any final offers? Oh, there we go. We've got one.
I was reading an article here that actually says that the 50 words for snow was debunked by somebody in 2012.
Yes.
However,
you ruined it, Mike. You ruined the whole illusion.
But apparently the Scots have 421 terms to describe the country's windy conditions. So there we go.
Right, there you go.
Take 50 away and give you 421 back.
Let's go over to Aaron. You've got your hand up.
Yes, no, thank you so much for this fantastic discussion, Fernando. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So one thing I've discovered over time is that there doesn't tend to be a value weighing hierarchy for delay that is enforced, right? So it becomes very cultural, right? You have some business units, some divisions, some product lines, whatever, that their culture has developed a get it done, GTD kind of no delay, customer centric, etc. And then there's others that just aren't, and hero martyrs, and everything in between go in, do their little burst, and then equilibrium resets. How have you, based on your experience, tried to shift that sort of cultural mindset around how to value delay? Because I found that, obviously the plumbing and the tooling, which is, fantastic that you've shown and we can all learn from and keep learning. But if the culture doesn't absorb it, then, we're the ones sort of, screaming on the top of the mountain, a person yelling at cloud. and and there just becomes, at a certain point you just get worn out, right? It's and then all the negativity sets in and so on. So hopefully that question, even though it was a little muddled, but hopefully it made sense to you.
So how you create awareness about this? That's really your question.
Well, it's not just awareness, because I think, to be honest, everyone has awareness of everything, and it doesn't matter, right? I mean, because, we're all smart humans with, astronomical nutrient metabolic processing. So now we just sort of suck it all in, but it doesn't, like action, right? Creating that sort of action.
What I meant is, I think everybody's aware of delay in the abstract. We're not aware of delay in our concrete case we're working on right now. So yes,
and the cost.
Everybody knows that work gets delayed. I don't think there is enough awareness on the delay that this particular item has incurred so far. So as with many other things, my first inclination would be to make all this visible somehow. So, and again, the conversation wouldn't really be about delay. Initially, it would be about, let's make the work visible, and then let's start exposing things. So you know how I started describing things like find your cues, right? So most likely people are unaware of all the cues that are already there. So my first discussion would be to let's expose those. Let's try to figure out places where work is already waiting, see if that is starting to fuel some of the other sources of dissatisfaction the team or the service or the people or the managers are complaining about, right? Because if you can make that connection, right? So if somebody says it takes forever to do this, I just had a conversation with the team this week, but it's been the tail end of several weeks of conversation, right? Their pain has to do with planning in a roadmap and blah, blah, blah. But what's fueling all that is the fact that, for example, their process is not very well understood, that there are many cues in it. So the moment we started making all this visible, that started bringing some, let's do something about it moments that we talk about in Kanban, right? So I think it starts with that visualization to make you aware of not the problem in the abstract, but in concrete terms about this item you're complaining about and this dissatisfaction you're having. How is this problem in your process is fueling that? So that would be my attempt for an answer. I'm not sure if that.
No, thank you. I appreciate it, because I've used the 7, lean wastes, cost of delay, but everyone just sort of rolls their eyes and.
Right, but this is because if you're familiar with the system 1, system 2 discussion we tend to have in the Kanban coaching side of things, that's a very logical system 2 type of argumentation. You may need to engage them emotionally in different ways. Engage your system 1 first, right?
That's been the story of my life, but that's a different story.
Get them aware of how their system of work is fueling their dissatisfaction and their emotional reactions, right?
Yeah. No, thank you.
You're very welcome. Maru and Guy. Sorry, Guy or Guy. I'm not sure how you pronounce your name.
Thanks. I'll try to go quick. I'm wondering, did you have any ideas, a visual way of modeling these delays in various types of systems you've worked on?
A visual, well, this is one. So start by making them visible on your board. They should show up as columns on your board somehow. Maybe not all of them, the most or the most important ones. That would be one. I think it depends on which one we're talking to. So for cues, well, there will become some sort of buffer somewhere. If it's something like dependencies, well, you have ways of visualizing dependencies on your board, perhaps by having a separate subsection of a column, for example. You divide your column into parts, work that is unaffected by delays or waiting on a dependency or not waiting on a dependency. So it comes back again to visualization. That would be my go-to technique.
Fernando, just to be concrete, I don't mean representation. I really mean the word modeling. Modeling, like it's used in modeling, in formal modeling, in model-driven engineering, in Lean Six Sigma.
Oh, modeling. Like building some sort of... like a mathematical model, for example?
Could be, but it doesn't have to be. If it's visual, it's at least semi-formal. So let me give you an example. In Lean Six Sigma, most of its value comes from the fact that you can model things, so you can work with them. I don't even mean the data analytics part. Let's say FMEA, like Aaron mentioned earlier in the chat, that's a visual way to model. The demonic life cycle. You mentioned something earlier that made me think of the question, which was, you said you could reverse engineer something by making some assumptions and then looking at particular signals that the system gives back. So
well, I know Alexi here in the call, he has done at some point a spreadsheet, for example, of a simulator for dependencies. So that's a form of model that allows to model, essentially to just simulate the impact of dependencies on your lead time based on your understanding of their nature and how long things take and how likely they are, and based on that you build some sort of simulator in Excel, for example. That would be one form of model. Other than that, Alexi.
Yeah. So I would just say, yes, that thing has existed for a long time already, and I know, for example, after I started doing it, for example, Paul Clip was one of the in Poland was one of the like very enthusiastic adopters of that technique. And Troy McGinnis has been doing something similar for even a longer period of time. However, like Fernando's answer to modeling for practical purposes, it's sufficient. My experience with such simulations, again, the big lesson out of like 10 years of this, or even more, is that do the simpler things. Do not overcomplicate. So really, like more than half of the value in that modeling is covered by what Fernando already gave you. If, let's say, queuing is an important source of delay in your process, you have to visualize the queue, because you have to make sure customers see it, senior managers see it, also stakeholders see it, team sees it. If you only have one geek with a simulation tool on their laptop seeing it, it's not doing anyone any good. If you have a dependency as an important source of delay in your process, then you have to visualize, and Fernando gave you tools for that. So we need to call out a section of the process where it may happen, give it a separate column on the Kanban board. We attach blockers to tickets that are affected by the dependency, and of course, tickets that are not affected by it, they don't get these blockers, or they're visually separated on the board. We make it explicit, like where that work goes after it's blocked, right? And again, everyone has to see it. Stakeholders, members of the team, managers of certain levels, managers of other services, perhaps managers managing other services that depend on the same shared service. Again, if you only have a couple of geeks in the organization with a simulation tool that are Monte Carloing the impact of that dependency, doesn't do anybody any good. And I could keep going on for basically all the other 50 types of snow that Fernando presented. So I think somewhere early in his presentation, Fernando showed like a sketch of a Kanban board that contains all the visual elements, and there are different visual elements to visualize different sources of delay, because that there's a different compelling way to do it depending on what type of snow you're dealing with, and that really goes a long way. Just being aware of why you have certain sources of delay in your process. Do you have them for a good reason, and how you're managing and mitigating them? And that's really the name of the game.